Victor Hargrove, a man whose name resonated through the halls of affluence and influence, was not one to be caught off guard. His life, a meticulously crafted tapestry of opulence and order, left little space for the unforeseen. Yet, as he exited his sleek black limousine onto the bustling streets of Manhattan, something caught his attention. A figure huddled in the shadows, just beyond the gleaming entrance of his five-star hotel. The rain was relentless that evening, pouring down in heavy sheets that blurred the city's neon lights into a vibrant mosaic of colors. Victor paused, his hand hovering over the door handle as he noticed the young woman sitting on the cold, wet pavement. She was shivering, her thin coat drenched, offering little protection against the biting wind. There was something about her, a certain vulnerability that tugged at something deep within him, something he had long buried. "Sir," the doorman's voice broke through his thoughts, but Victor waved him off, his gaze still fixed on the girl. She looked up as he approached, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and exhaustion. They were strikingly green, those eyes, like a calm forest under a stormy sky. For a moment, Victor was taken aback, struck by how young she seemed, and how utterly out of place she looked against the backdrop of the luxurious hotel. "What are you doing out here in this weather?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. The girl blinked, startled by his attention. "I'm just trying to find somewhere to stay dry," she stammered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. "I'll leave if you want me to." Victor hesitated. He wasn't a man who typically involved himself in the affairs of strangers, let alone those who lingered outside his property. But something about her, maybe it was the way she looked at him, or perhaps it was the fleeting memory of someone he once loved, made him pause. "Come inside," he said, surprising even himself with the offer. The girl's eyes widened in disbelief. "I can't. I don't have any money." Victor shook his head. "That doesn't matter. You'll catch your death out here. Come, at least get warm." Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked toward the hotel entrance, half expecting her not to follow. But after a moment of hesitation, he heard the soft shuffle of footsteps behind him. Inside, the lobby was a world away from the storm raging outside. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over marble floors, and the air was filled with the scent of fresh flowers and expensive perfume. Guests milled about in evening wear, oblivious of the world beyond the glass doors. Victor led the girl to a quiet corner, where a plush chair waited. "Sit," he instructed, and she sank into the chair with a sigh of relief, her body trembling from the cold. A staff member appeared almost instantly, offering a thick blanket and a cup of hot tea. The girl accepted them with shaking hands, mumbling her thanks. Victor watched her closely, his mind racing with questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. Who was she? Why was she out there alone? And why did he feel this inexplicable urge to help her? "What's your name?" he asked finally, breaking the silence. "Sophie," she replied, her voice soft, but more steady now. "Sophie Lane." "Sophie," Victor repeated, the name rolling off his tongue, as if it held some hidden significance. "You have no place to stay?" She shook her head, her eyes downcast. "No, I lost my job and I couldn't pay rent. I've been trying to get by, but it's been hard." Victor felt a pang of something he hadn't felt in years: compassion, empathy, perhaps even guilt. He couldn't ignore the fact that while he lived in unimaginable comfort, people like Sophie were struggling just to survive. He stood up, making a quick decision. "You'll stay here tonight. We'll find you a room." Sophie looked up at him, her eyes brimming with tears. "I can't let you do that. It's too much." "Nonsense," Victor replied firmly. "It's just for one night. We'll figure things out in the morning." Before she could protest further, he signaled to the concierge, who nodded and moved to make the arrangements. Victor turned back to Sophie, offering her a small, reassuring smile. "You're safe here," he said quietly. Sophie didn't respond, but the look in her eyes said it all: relief, gratitude, and perhaps just a glimmer of hope. As he walked away, Victor couldn't help but feel a strange sense of purpose. This small act of kindness had stirred something within him, something he thought had died long ago with the woman he loved. Little did he know, this chance encounter would set off a chain of events that would change both their lives forever. The next morning, Victor found himself drawn back to the hotel earlier than usual. He couldn't explain it, but something about the young woman he had helped the night before lingered in his mind. As he entered the grand lobby, his eyes instinctively searched for any sign of her. He found Sophie seated by one of the tall windows, wrapped in the same blanket from the night before. The morning light streamed in, casting a soft glow on her face. She looked better, but there was still a fragility to her that tugged at his heart. "Good morning," Victor greeted, startling her from her thoughts. Sophie looked up, a shy smile tugging at her lips. "Good morning," she replied, her voice still soft but warmer than it had been the night before. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, pulling out a chair to sit across from her. Sophie nodded, a hint of color rising to her cheeks. "Yes, thank you. I can't remember the last time I slept in a bed like that." Victor hesitated for a moment, then leaned forward slightly. "Sophie, I need to ask, how did you end up here? In this situation?" She looked down at her hands, fiddling with the edge of the blanket. "It's a long story," she began, her voice tinged with the weight of her memories. "I came to the city hoping for a better life. I had dreams of becoming a singer, but things didn't go as planned. I lost my job, and with it, my apartment. It all happened so fast. One day I was okay, and the next, I had nothing." Victor listened intently, noticing the way her voice trembled slightly as she spoke. There was pain in her words, but also a quiet resilience that impressed him. "And the singing?" he asked gently. "Do you still sing?" A small smile flickered across her face. "Yes, whenever I can. It's the only thing that keeps me going." Victor felt a sudden pang of familiarity, as if her story was echoing something buried deep within him. He leaned back in his chair, staring out the window at the bustling city below. "My wife," he began slowly, used to sing. She had a voice that could stop time, make everything else fade away. But she passed away many years ago. Sophie's eyes softened with understanding. "I'm sorry," she whispered, sensing the depth of his loss. "She used to sing to our daughter even before she was born," Victor continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "But she never got the chance to hold her. Emily died during childbirth, and our daughter, well, she didn't survive either." There was a long silence between them, the weight of shared grief filling the space. For Victor, these memories were like shards of glass, painful and sharp. Yet he found himself opening up to Sophie in a way he hadn't with anyone else. Perhaps it was her gentleness, or the way she listened without judgment, that made him feel he could share this part of himself. "I'm sorry," Sophie said again, her voice steady despite the tears glistening in her eyes. "It sounds like she was a remarkable woman." "She was," Victor agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "And sometimes when I hear certain songs, it's like she's still here, singing to me." Sophie hesitated for a moment before speaking. Would you like to hear a song? It's something my mother used to sing to me when I was a child. It's one of the few things I have left of her." Victor nodded, unable to find the words. Sophie took a deep breath, then began to sing softly, her voice filling the quiet morning air. It was a haunting melody, one that seemed to weave its way through the room, wrapping around Victor like a comforting embrace. As she sang, Victor felt a rush of memories flood back. Emily's laughter, the way she used to sing to their unborn child, and the overwhelming love he had felt for both of them. Tears welled up in his eyes, and for the first time in years, he didn't try to hold them back. When Sophie finished, the room was silent, save for the distant hum of the city outside. Victor looked at her, his vision blurred with tears. "That was beautiful," he whispered. "Thank you." Sophie smiled, a small, sad smile that spoke of understanding and shared sorrow. "Thank you for giving me a chance," she replied softly, "not just to sing, but to be heard." In that moment, Victor realized that this young woman who had stumbled into his life by chance had touched something deep within him, a part of him he thought he had lost forever. And as they sat there, in the quiet of the morning, Victor knew that his life was about to change in ways he could never have anticipated. Over the next few days, Victor found himself increasingly preoccupied with thoughts of Sophie. He tried to maintain his usual routine: meetings with business partners, phone calls with high-profile clients, and overseeing the daily operations of his vast empire. But no matter what he did, his mind kept drifting back to the young woman he had taken in from the rain. Her voice, that haunting melody she had sung, played over and over in his head, as if it were a key unlocking memories he had long buried. It was on a quiet afternoon, when the hotel was unusually still, that Victor heard it again. He was in his private office on the top floor, reviewing some documents, when the faint sound of singing reached his ears. At first, he thought he was imagining it, a trick of the mind. But as the notes grew clearer, he realized it was real. Sophie was singing. He set down his papers, rising from his chair as if in a trance. The sound pulled him, beckoning him to follow. He left his office, walking down the corridor toward the source of the music. It was a lullaby, one he hadn't heard in years. Yet every note was etched into his memory. His heart pounded as he reached the door of the suite where Sophie was staying. He hesitated for a moment, unsure if he should intrude. But the pull of the music was too strong. He knocked lightly, and when there was no answer, he slowly pushed the door open. Sophie was sitting by the window, just as she had been the first morning. But now her eyes were closed, her face peaceful as she sang. The room was bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, casting a warm glow over everything. Victor stood in the doorway, captivated by the scene before him. He didn't dare move, afraid that any sound might break the spell. The song came to an end, and Sophie opened her eyes, startled to see Victor standing there. She quickly rose to her feet, a look of apology on her face. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to disturb you." "You didn't," Victor interrupted, his voice thick with emotion. "Please don't stop. That song, it was Emily's favorite." Sophie's expression softened, and she slowly sat back down, sensing that Victor had more to say. He stepped into the room, moving to the window where he could see the city stretching out below them, the sun dipping low on the horizon. "I haven't heard that song in years," he began, his gaze distant. "Emily used to sing it all the time, especially when she was pregnant. She said it made her feel connected to our daughter, even before she was born. I thought I'd never hear it again." Sophie watched him carefully, her heart aching for the man who stood before her, clearly still haunted by the ghosts of his past. "It was my mother's song, too," she said quietly. "She used to sing it to me every night. I don't remember much about her, but that song, it's always stayed with me." Victor turned to face her, his eyes searching hers as if trying to piece together a puzzle. "Your mother, what was her name?" "Clara," Sophie replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Clara Lane." The name sent a jolt through Victor, like a spark igniting a long-forgotten memory. He hadn't heard that name in decades, but it was one he could never forget. Clara had been Emily's closest friend, almost like a sister to her. They had grown up together, inseparable, until life had taken them down different paths. After Emily's death, Victor had lost touch with everyone from that time, too consumed by his grief to keep any connections alive. "Clara," he repeated, the name heavy on his tongue. "She was Emily's best friend." Sophie's eyes widened in surprise. "You knew her?" Victor nodded slowly, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the revelation. "Yes, a long time ago. She was there when Emily and I got married. I didn't know she had a daughter." Sophie's brow furrowed in confusion. "She never mentioned you or Emily. I only know she left home when I was young. I always thought it was because of me." "No," Victor said quickly, stepping closer to her. "It wasn't because of you. Clara and Emily, they had a falling out just before Emily passed. I never knew why. Maybe she left to escape the pain, or maybe it was something else. But it was never your fault. Sophie's eyes filled with tears. The weight of years of doubt and guilt suddenly lifted from her shoulders. "I've always wondered," she whispered. "I thought if I could just find her, maybe I could understand why she left." Victor felt an overwhelming sense of connection to this girl who had unknowingly brought back a piece of his lost past. He reached out, taking her hand in his. "I'm sorry for what you've been through, Sophie, but I want you to know you're not alone in this. Whatever answers you're looking for, we'll find them together." Tears streamed down Sophie's cheeks, but for the first time in a long time, they weren't tears of sorrow. She squeezed Victor's hand, a silent thank you for the kindness and understanding he had shown her. In that moment, both of them knew that their lives had become intertwined in a way neither could have anticipated. What had started as a chance encounter was now unfolding into a journey of healing and discovery, one that would lead them both to confront the past and find the strength to move forward together. The next morning, Victor was already waiting in the lobby when Sophie descended the grand staircase. She was dressed in clothes he had arranged for her, a simple, elegant outfit that suited her well. The transformation from the shivering girl he had found outside to the composed young woman before him was remarkable. But what struck him most was the determination in her eyes. They were no longer filled with fear, but with a quiet resolve. "Good morning," she greeted him with a tentative smile, her voice steady. "Good morning, Sophie," Victor replied, standing as she approached. "Are you ready?" Sophie nodded, though there was a hint of nervousness in her expression. "As ready as I'll ever be." Victor had spent much of the previous night making arrangements. After their conversation, he had contacted some old acquaintances, people who might hold the key to the mystery surrounding Clara. Now, they were set to visit a woman who had been a close friend to both Clara and Emily, a woman named Helen, who had been like a second mother to the two girls. As they drove through the city, Victor noticed the tension in Sophie's posture, the way she twisted her hands in her lap. He reached over, gently placing his hand over hers. "Whatever we find out today, remember that you're not alone in this. We'll face it together." Sophie looked at him, her eyes softening. "Thank you, Victor. I don't think I could do this without you." The car pulled up to a modest brownstone in a quiet neighborhood, a stark contrast to the glitz and glamour of Victor's world. Helen's home was warm and inviting, with ivy climbing the walls and a small garden in front. Victor and Sophie exchanged a glance before stepping out of the car and approaching the front door. Helen opened the door almost immediately, as if she had been waiting for them. She was an older woman, her silver hair pulled back into a neat bun, her eyes sharp and curious. But when she saw Victor, those eyes softened with recognition, and a sad smile touched her lips. "Victor Hargrove," she said, her voice warm with nostalgia. "It's been years." Victor returned her smile, though it was tinged with sadness. "Too many, Helen." Helen's gaze shifted to Sophie, and her expression turned thoughtful. "And you must be Sophie," she said, as if she already knew who she was. "Come in, both of you. We have a lot to talk about." They followed Helen into a cozy sitting room where the smell of freshly brewed tea filled the air. The walls were lined with photographs, each telling a story of a life well lived. Victor's eyes caught a picture of Emily, smiling brightly, her arm around a younger Clara. The sight of it made his heart ache with bittersweet memories. Once they were settled, Helen poured them tea, her movements deliberate and calm, as if she were preparing for a conversation that had been a long time coming. "So, you want to know about Clara," Helen began, her gaze fixed on Sophie. "I knew this day would come eventually." Sophie leaned forward, her voice trembling slightly. "Yes, I've spent so many years wondering why she left, why she never came back for me. I need to understand." Helen sighed, a deep, weary sound, as she set her teacup down. Clara was a complicated woman, full of contradictions. She loved you, Sophie, never doubt that. But she was also haunted by her past, by things she could never quite let go. Victor watched as Helen spoke, noting the way Sophie's hands trembled slightly as she listened. He wanted to reach out, to comfort her, but he knew this was a journey she had to take on her own, at least for now. What happened between her and Emily? Victor asked, breaking the silence that had fallen over the room. Why did they drift apart? Helen's expression grew pained, and she looked away for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "It was over a man," she finally said, her voice heavy with regret. A man who came between them, someone Clara fell in love with, but it was a love that was never meant to be. Emily found out, and she felt betrayed, not because of the man, but because Clara had kept it a secret. Their friendship was everything to Emily, and when that trust was broken, so was their bond. Sophie's eyes widened and she leaned forward, her voice barely a whisper. Who was he? Helen hesitated, as if weighing the consequences of revealing the truth. Then, with a deep breath, she said, "His name was Michael. He was a friend of Victor's, someone who was close to both Emily and Clara. But he was married, and when Clara realized she couldn't be with him, she left. She couldn't face Emily, couldn't face the life she wanted but couldn't have. So, she ran." Victor's heart clenched at the name. He remembered Michael, a man who had been a close friend, someone he had trusted. The revelation hit him like a blow, and he saw the shock on Sophie's face. "Why didn't she come back?" Sophie asked, her voice breaking with emotion. "Why didn't she come back for me?" Helen's eyes filled with sadness. "She wanted to, Sophie. But by then, she was too far gone. She was lost in her own guilt and grief, convinced that you would be better off without her. She didn't know how to face the life she had left behind. So, she tried to start over. But the past has a way of catching up with us." Tears streamed down Sophie's face, and she wiped them away with trembling hands. "I just wanted to know why she didn't want me," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I spent so many nights wondering what I did wrong." Helen reached out, placing a comforting hand on Sophie's. "You did nothing wrong, my dear. Clara loved you more than anything in this world, but she was a woman who didn't know how to fight her own demons. She made mistakes, but they were hers, not yours." Victor felt a wave of emotion crash over him as he watched Sophie grapple with the weight of her mother's past. He knew that no words could take away the pain she was feeling, but he also knew that the truth, as painful as it was the first step toward healing. Sophie looked at Helen, her eyes red from crying, but filled with a new sense of determination. "What do I do now?" she asked, her voice small but steady. Helen smiled sadly. "You live, Sophie. You take the love your mother had for you, flawed as it was, and you make something beautiful out of it. Don't let her mistakes define you. You're stronger than that." Victor placed his hand on Sophie's shoulder, offering her silent support. "We'll figure it out, Sophie. Together." As they left Helen's home, the sun had begun to set, painting the sky with shades of pink and orange. Victor and Sophie walked in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. But as they reached the car, Sophie turned to Victor, her expression more at peace than it had been in years. "Thank you, Victor," she said softly, "for everything." He smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes. "You don't have to thank me, Sophie. We're in this together." As they drove back to the hotel, the city lights began to twinkle in the twilight. And for the first time in a long time, Victor felt a sense of hope. The past was painful, full of loss and regret. But he knew that with Sophie by his side, there was a chance for both of them to heal and to find a future where they could finally let go of the ghost that had haunted them for so long. The drive back to the hotel was quiet, both Victor and Sophie lost in the whirlwind of emotions stirred up by their visit to Helen. The city passed by in a blur of lights and shadows, the weight of the revelation still heavy on their minds. But amidst the turmoil, there was a sense of clarity, a path forward, albeit one paved with the painful truths of the past. When they finally arrived, Victor suggested they go up to his private lounge, a quiet, secluded space where they could talk without interruption. As they sat across from each other, the city spread out beneath them, Victor poured them both a glass of wine. He handed one to Sophie, who accepted it with a shaky hand. "I know this is a lot to take in," Victor began, his voice gentle. "But I want you to know that you don't have to go through this alone. Whatever you need, I'm here for you." Sophie took a sip of her wine, her eyes distant as she processed everything they had learned. It's all so overwhelming," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I spent my whole life wondering why she left, thinking it was because of me. And now I find out it had nothing to do with me and everything to do with a man she couldn't be with. It's just so much to take in." Victor nodded, understanding her turmoil all too well. "I know how it feels to carry that kind of weight," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "When Emily died, I blamed myself for a long time. I thought that if I had done something differently, maybe things would have turned out another way. But life doesn't work like that. We make our choices, and we live with the consequences, even if they're not what we expected." Sophie looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and gratitude. "It must have been so hard for you, losing her like that. I can't even imagine." "It was," Victor admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "It nearly destroyed me. But then I met you, and you've brought something back into my life that I thought was gone forever. Hope." Sophie's eyes filled with tears, and she set down her glass, unable to hold back the emotion any longer. "I felt so lost for so long," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But being here with you, it's like I finally found a piece of myself that I didn't even know was missing." Victor reached out, taking her hand in his. "You're not lost, Sophie. You've just been searching for the right path. And now, I think we've found it." Sophie squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his presence. "Thank you, Victor," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "I don't know how I would have faced all of this without you." "You don't have to," Victor replied firmly. "We're in this together now." The silence that followed was filled with unspoken understanding, a bond that had formed between them through shared pain and the search for healing. It was a connection that neither of them had expected, but one that had become an undeniable part of their lives. After a while, Sophie broke the silence. "Helen mentioned something about my mother's guilt and grief. Do you think she ever forgave herself?" Victor sighed, a deep, heavy sound. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I do know that forgiveness is a difficult thing to find, especially when it's yourself you need to forgive. But maybe that's something we can help each other with." Sophie nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I'd like that," she whispered. They sat in silence for a while longer, watching as the city lights flickered on one by one, illuminating the darkness. It was a comforting sight, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was always a light to guide the way. Finally, Victor stood, offering his hand to Sophie. "Come on," he said softly. "There's something I want to show you." Curious, Sophie took his hand, and he led her out onto the balcony. The view from the top of the hotel was breathtaking. The entire city laid out before them like a glittering tapestry. But it wasn't the view that Victor wanted to show her. "There's a reason I brought you up here," he said, his voice low and reverent. "This was Emily's favorite place. Whenever she needed to clear her head, she'd come up here and just breathe. It was where she felt closest to our daughter, even after she was gone." Sophie looked out over the city, feeling a deep connection to the woman she had never met, but who had played such a pivotal role in her life. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Victor nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It is. And now I want you to have this place, a place where you can feel connected to your mother, where you can find peace." Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes as she looked at Victor, overwhelmed by the depth of his kindness. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I don't know how to ever repay you for everything you've done for me." "You don't have to," Victor replied, his voice gentle. "Just knowing that you're finding your way is enough." As they stood together, side by side, the city stretched out before them. Sophie felt something shift within her, a sense of closure, but also a new beginning. The past was painful, and the scars it left would never fully heal. But she knew now that she didn't have to face it alone. Victor was there, and together, they would find a way to move forward one step at a time. For the first time in years, Sophie felt like she was finally home. Over the following weeks, Victor and Sophie settled into a new rhythm, their lives intertwined in a way neither had anticipated. Sophie began to open up more, sharing stories from her past, her dreams of becoming a singer, and the challenges she had faced along the way. Victor, in turn, shared more about his life with Emily, the love they had shared, and the pain of losing her. Their days were filled with quiet moments of connection. Morning walks through the city, evenings spent in the hotel's private lounge, and late-night conversations on the balcony where they found solace in each other's company. It was during one of these evenings, as they watched the city lights flicker below, that Sophie hesitantly brought up a topic she had been avoiding. "Victor," she began softly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the city. "I've been thinking a lot about my mother, about what Helen told us. And I keep wondering, what if she's still out there? What if she's alive somewhere?" Victor turned to face her, his expression thoughtful. He had been thinking about the same thing, but hadn't wanted to push Sophie to confront the possibility if she wasn't ready. "It's possible," he said carefully, "but finding her might not be easy. She left for a reason, and if she's still out there, she might not want to be found." Sophie nodded, her gaze distant as she considered his words. "I know," she replied, her voice heavy with emotion. "But I have to try. I need to know why she left, why she never came back for me. I need to hear it from her." Victor reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "Then we'll find her," he said firmly. "Whatever it takes, we'll find her." Sophie looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't think I could do this without you." "You don't have to," Victor replied, his grip on her hand tightening. "We're in this together. Remember?" Over the next few days, Victor began making discreet inquiries, using his extensive network of contacts to track down any leads on Clara Lane. It wasn't easy. Years had passed since she had disappeared, and she had left little trace behind. But Victor was determined, and with Sophie's encouragement, he continued to dig deeper. Meanwhile, Sophie threw herself into her music, finding solace in the songs that had once been her only source of comfort. She spent hours in the hotel's music room, her voice filling the space with haunting melodies that seemed to echo the emotions she couldn't put into words. Victor often found himself standing outside the door, listening in silence, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and sorrow. One evening, after a particularly emotional session, Victor knocked on the door of the music room. Sophie opened it, her eyes red from crying, but she managed a small smile when she saw him. "You're amazing, you know that?" Victor said softly, his voice filled with admiration. Sophie shook her head, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I'm just trying to make sense of everything," she whispered. "Music is the only way I know how." Victor stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "You don't have to carry this burden alone, Sophie," he said gently. "Let me help you." Sophie looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "I'm so scared, Victor," she admitted, her voice breaking. "What if we find her and she doesn't want anything to do with me? What if she's moved on and I'm just a part of her past she wants to forget?" Victor took a deep breath, knowing that no matter what he said, there were no guarantees. "I can't promise you that everything will be okay," he said honestly, "but I can promise that I'll be there with you every step of the way. And no matter what happens, you'll never have to face it alone." Sophie's resolve seemed to strengthen at his words, and she nodded, wiping away her tears. "Thank you," she said, her voice steadier now. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Victor smiled a warm, reassuring smile that made her feel safe. "You're stronger than you think, Sophie. And whatever happens, we'll get through it together." Days turned into weeks as they continued their search. each new lead bringing them closer to the truth. Victor's contacts were able to trace Clara's movements to a small town in the Midwest, where she had lived under a different name. But just as they thought they were getting close, the trail went cold. Despite the setback, Sophie refused to give up. She spent hours poring over old documents, trying to piece together her mother's life from the fragments they had uncovered. Victor was by her side every step of the way, offering support and encouragement when she needed it most. Then one afternoon, as Sophie was going through a stack of old letters they had found, she came across something that made her heart skip a beat. It was a letter dated a few years after her mother had disappeared, addressed to someone named Helen, a name that immediately caught Sophie's attention. "Victor," she called out, her voice trembling with excitement. "I think I found something." Victor hurried over, his eyes scanning the letter as Sophie held it out to him. It was a brief, cryptic note, but it mentioned a town, Clearwater, and a date that coincided with the time Clara had gone off the grid. "This could be it," Victor said, his voice filled with hope. "This could be the lead we've been looking for." Sophie nodded, her heart racing. "We have to go there," she said, her voice resolute. "I need to find out if she's there, if she's alive." Victor didn't hesitate. "Then let's go," he said, determination in his voice. "We'll leave first thing in the morning." As they packed for the trip, the air was filled with a sense of anticipation, a mixture of hope and fear that neither of them could shake. The next day, they boarded a plane to Clearwater, the small town where they hoped to finally find the answers they had been searching for. As the plane touched down, Victor glanced at Sophie, who was staring out the window, her face a mixture of determination and anxiety. He reached over, gently squeezing her hand. "We're almost there," he said softly. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Sophie turned to him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I'm ready," she whispered, though her voice betrayed the nerves she was trying to suppress. Victor smiled, a reassuring presence beside her. "You're stronger than you know, Sophie. And no matter what we find, I'm proud of you for coming this far." As they stepped off the plane and into the unknown, both Victor and Sophie knew that this was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment where the past and present would collide, and where the truth, no matter how painful, would finally be revealed. The town of Clearwater was small, almost forgotten, nestled among rolling hills and dense forests. As Victor and Sophie drove through its quiet streets, they both felt the weight of anticipation pressing down on them. The town had a stillness to it, the kind that made it feel like time had stood still, preserving memories and secrets alike. They checked into a modest inn, its faded sign swinging gently in the breeze. The innkeeper, a kind elderly woman with a knowing smile, welcomed them warmly, though her curious gaze lingered on Sophie for a moment longer than usual. It was as if she sensed the importance of their visit, but she asked no questions, leaving them to their thoughts. Once they settled into their room, Sophie paced nervously, her thoughts racing. What if she's not here? What if we're too late? She voiced her fears aloud, her hands trembling as she twisted them together. Victor watched her, his heart aching at the anxiety etched on her face. "We can't think like that," he said gently, walking over to her. "We've come this far, Sophie. We have to believe that we'll find her." Sophie nodded, though the doubt in her eyes remained. "I know. It's just, I've waited so long for this moment. I don't know what I'll do if it doesn't turn out the way I hope." Victor reached out, taking her hands in his. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together. You're not alone." His words seemed to bring her some comfort, and she took a deep breath, steadying herself. "You're right," she said, her voice stronger now. "I have to see this through." The next morning, armed with the address from the letter, they set out for the outskirts of town. The road wound through a dense forest, the trees tall and ancient, their branches forming a canopy overhead. The further they drove, the more isolated the landscape became, until they reached a small, weathered house at the end of a gravel road. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest as they pulled up to the house. It was a modest place, its paint peeling and the garden overgrown. But there was something about it that felt familiar to her, as if she had seen it in a dream. She glanced at Victor, who gave her a reassuring nod, then turned her attention back to the house. "Are you ready?" Victor asked, his voice soft but steady. Sophie swallowed hard, then nodded. "I think so," she whispered, though her voice trembled slightly. They got out of the car and walked up the short path to the front door. Sophie's hand shook as she reached out to knock, but before she could, the door creaked open, revealing a woman who looked both familiar and yet like a stranger. The woman was older, her once dark hair streaked with gray, her face lined with years of worry and hardship. But her eyes, those deep, familiar eyes, were unmistakable. They were Sophie's eyes. "Mom." Sophie's voice was barely audible, her breath catching in her throat as she took in the sight of the woman she had been searching for all these years. The woman's eyes widened in shock, her hand flying to her mouth as tears welled up in her eyes. "Sophie," she whispered, her voice breaking as she took a step forward, as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Sophie nodded, her own tears spilling over. "It's me, Mom. It's really me." For a moment, there was only silence, the air thick with emotion as mother and daughter stood facing each other, years of separation and pain hanging between them. Then, with a sob, the woman, Clara, rushed forward, pulling Sophie into a tight embrace, holding her as if she were afraid she might disappear. "My baby," Clara cried, her voice choked with emotion. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Sophie clung to her mother, her own tears falling freely now. "I missed you so much," she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of all the years she had spent wondering, waiting, hoping for this moment. "I didn't understand why you left." Clara pulled back just enough to look into Sophie's eyes, her own filled with guilt and regret. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she said, her voice heavy with sorrow. "I thought you'd be better off without me, that you'd have a better life if I wasn't around to mess it up." Sophie shook her head, her heart breaking at the pain in her mother's voice. "But I needed you, Mom. I needed you so much." "I know," Clara whispered, her tears falling like rain. "And I'm so sorry that I wasn't there for you. But you have to believe me, Sophie. I never stopped loving you. Not for a single moment." Victor watched from a few steps away, his own emotions swirling as he witnessed the reunion. He felt a deep sense of relief that Sophie had found her mother, but also a sadness for all the years they had lost. He knew that the road to healing would be long, but this was the first step, a crucial step toward reconciliation and forgiveness. After a long moment, Clara finally noticed Victor standing nearby. Her eyes widened slightly in recognition, and she looked back at Sophie, a question in her gaze. "This is Victor," Sophie explained, her voice still shaky from the tears. "He's been helping me, helping us find you." Clara wiped her eyes, giving Victor a grateful nod. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere. "Thank you for bringing my daughter back to me." Victor shook his head, a small smile on his lips. "It was Sophie's strength that brought us here," he said gently. "I'm just glad I could be a part of it." Clara gestured toward the house, her expression a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "Would you both like to come inside? There's so much we need to talk about." Sophie nodded, still holding on to her mother's hand, as if afraid to let go. "Yes," she said, her voice filled with determination. "We have a lot to catch up on." As they stepped inside the small, cozy house, Victor couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. The walls were lined with photographs, many of them old and faded, but each one told a story that had been left unfinished for too long. They sat down in the living room, the atmosphere thick with emotion. Clara looked at Sophie, her eyes full of love and regret. "I know I can't make up for all the years we lost," she began, her voice trembling. "But I want to try. I want to be a part of your life again, if you'll let me." Sophie reached out, taking her mother's hand in hers. "I want that too, Mom," she said softly. I want to get to know you, to understand what happened, and to move forward together. Clara's eyes filled with tears once more, but this time they were tears of hope. Thank you, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Thank you for giving me another chance. As the evening wore on, they talked for hours, sharing stories and memories, filling in the gaps of all the years they had missed. Victor listened quietly, offering support when needed, but mostly just allowing mother and daughter the space they needed to reconnect. By the time the sun began to set, casting a warm golden light through the windows, there was a sense of peace in the room, a sense that, despite all the pain and heartache, they had found their way back to each other. As they prepared to leave, Clara walked them to the door, her hand still holding Sophie's. I know we have a long road ahead of us, she said softly, her voice filled with determination. But I'm ready to walk it with you, whatever it takes. Sophie smiled, her heart full for the first time in years. Me too, Mom. Me too. Victor watched them, his heart swelling with pride for the journey Sophie had taken. As they drove away from the small house in Clearwater, he knew that this was only the beginning. That was incredible, Richard said, his voice filled with genuine awe. You've poured so much of yourself into that song. It's raw, it's honest, it's beautiful. Lily smiled shyly, her cheeks flushing at his praise. Thank you. It's been brewing in my mind for a while now. I guess everything that's happened, finding my mom, reconnecting with my past, it all just came pouring out. Richard nodded, his expression thoughtful. Music has a way of doing that, doesn't it? It's like a language that speaks directly to the soul. And you've got a gift, Lily, a real gift. She looked down at her guitar, her fingers lightly tracing the strings. I've always loved music. It's been my escape, my comfort, my way of making sense of the world. But now, I feel like I'm ready to share it with others, to let my story be heard. That's a big step, Richard said, sitting down across from her. But I think you're ready. You've come so far, Lily. You've faced your past, and now you're ready to step into your future. And I'll be here to support you every step of the way. Lily looked up at him, her eyes shining with gratitude. I don't know what I'd do without you, Richard. You've been my rock through all of this. You've believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself. Richard reached out, placing a hand over hers. You've always had the strength within you, Lily. I just helped you see it. And now, the world's going to see it too. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the moment settling over them. For Lily, it felt like a turning point, a moment where the past no longer held her back, and the future was full of endless possibilities. So, what's next? Richard asked, breaking the silence. Lily took a deep breath, her mind racing with ideas. I think it's time to start performing again. Maybe small venues at first, just to get my feet wet. And then who knows, maybe I'll record an album, share my story with the world. Richard smiled, his eyes lighting up with excitement. That sounds like a perfect plan. And I'll be there, front row, cheering you on every step of the way. Lily laughed, the sound light and carefree. I'll hold you to that. As the morning stretched on, they talked more about her plans, brainstorming ideas and making lists of things she'd need to get started. It was a new chapter, one filled with hope and excitement, and Lily couldn't wait to see where it would lead. Later that day, Evelyn joined them for lunch, and Lily shared her plans with her mother. Evelyn listened intently, her eyes filled with pride and admiration. I'm so proud of you, Lily, Evelyn said, her voice thick with emotion. You've turned your pain into something beautiful, and I know your music is going to touch so many lives. Lily smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. Thank you, Mom. That means a lot to me. Evelyn reached out, taking Lily's hand in hers. I know I haven't been there for you in the past, but I'm here now, and I want to be a part of your life, to support you in whatever way I can. Lily squeezed her mother's hand, feeling a sense of closure and healing that she hadn't thought possible. I'm glad you're here, Mom. I really am. As the days turned into weeks, Lily began to take small steps toward her dream. She performed at a few local cafes, her music resonating with the audiences who listened. Each performance was a step forward, a chance to share her story and connect with others who had faced their own struggles. Richard was there for every performance, his unwavering support giving her the confidence she needed to keep going. And Evelyn was there too, slowly rebuilding the bond that had been broken for so long. One evening, after a particularly emotional performance, Lily stood on the small stage, the applause of the audience ringing in her ears. She looked out into the crowd, her eyes finding Richard and Evelyn, who were smiling up at her with pride. In that moment, she felt a sense of peace and fulfillment that she had never known before. The past had shaped her, but it no longer defined her. She was ready to embrace the future, to create a life filled with music, love, and the people who mattered most. As she stepped off the stage, Richard and Evelyn greeted her with hugs and words of encouragement. "You were amazing," Richard said, his eyes shining with admiration. Evelyn nodded, tears in her eyes. "You've come so far, Lily. I'm so proud of you." Lily smiled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the people who had stood by her side. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "I couldn't have done it without you both." As they left the cafe, the city lights twinkling around them, Lily felt a sense of hope and excitement for the future. The road ahead was still uncertain, but she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she wouldn't have to face them alone. For the first time in her life, Lily felt truly free. Free to embrace her past, to live in the present, and to dream of a future filled with endless possibilities. And as she walked hand in hand with Richard and Evelyn, she knew that this was only the beginning of a new and beautiful chapter in her life. "You've been more than just support, Richard. You've been my anchor. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. You gave me the courage to face my past and the strength to move forward. I wouldn't be here without you." Richard's eyes softened, and he reached out to take her hand. "Lily, you've always had that strength inside you. I just helped you see it. But if I've been able to be there for you, to stand by your side through all of this, then I'm grateful for that. You've changed my life too, you know." Lily's heart swelled at his words, and she felt a warmth spread through her chest. "I don't know what the future holds," she said softly, "but I know one thing for certain. I want you in it, Richard. Whatever comes next, I want us to face it together." Richard smiled, his gaze steady and full of emotion. "There's nowhere else I'd rather be," he said, his voice low and sincere. "You've brought something into my life that I didn't even realize I was missing. You've made me believe in second chances, in the possibility of healing, and I'm not going anywhere." Lily felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but they were tears of joy, of relief, of hope. She squeezed his hand, feeling the weight of everything they'd been through together and the promise of what lay ahead. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." They stood there for a moment, the city stretching out before them, the sun dipping below the horizon and painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. It felt like a metaphor for their journey, the darkness giving way to light, the past making way for the future. As the first stars began to twinkle in the evening sky, Lily turned to Richard with a small, determined smile. "I think it's time for me to take the next step," she said. "With my music, with my life. I want to keep sharing my story, but I also want to help others find their voice, their strength. I want to create something meaningful, something that makes a difference." Richard nodded, his expression filled with pride. "You already are, Lily. Your music, your story. It's touching people in ways you can't even imagine. And I know you're going to do incredible things. Whatever you decide, I'll be right here, cheering you on." Lily's smile widened, and she felt a surge of determination. "I've been thinking about starting a foundation," she said, her voice gaining confidence as she spoke. "Something to help people who've been through similar struggles. People who felt lost, who've needed someone to believe in them. I want to give them the same chance you gave me." Richard's eyes lit up, and he nodded enthusiastically. "That's an amazing idea, Lily, and I'll help you every step of the way. We'll make it happen together." Lily felt a wave of gratitude wash over her, and she leaned into Richard, resting her head on his shoulder. "I'm so lucky to have you," she murmured, her voice filled with emotion. "No," Richard said softly, wrapping an arm around her. "I'm the lucky one." They stood there for a while, the city humming softly around them, the stars growing brighter in the night sky. It was a moment of peace, of connection, of shared dreams and endless possibilities. Finally, Lily straightened, a spark of excitement in her eyes. "Let's start tomorrow," she said, her voice filled with determination. "Let's take the first step toward building something that can help others." "I don't want to wait anymore." Richard smiled, his heart swelling with pride and admiration. "Tomorrow it is," he agreed. "But for tonight, let's just enjoy this moment. You've earned it." Lily nodded, her heart full as she looked out at the city she now called home. The past had shaped her, but it no longer defined her. She was ready to embrace the future, to create a life filled with purpose, love, and the people who mattered most. And as she stood there with Richard by her side, she knew that whatever came next, she was ready to face it, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever needed a second chance. The night stretched on, the city lights twinkling like stars, and Lily felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. This was her new beginning, and she couldn't wait to see where it would take her. With Richard by her side, she knew that anything was possible, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly, completely free. The night air was cool and crisp, the city below them alive with the hum of life. Lily leaned into Richard's embrace, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against her. It was a moment of quiet, of stillness, of knowing that everything she had been through had led her here, to this place, to this man, to this love. "You've changed everything for me," Lily said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was so lost, so broken. I didn't think I'd ever find my way again. But you showed me that I could heal, that I could be whole again." Richard tightened his arms around her, his voice warm and steady. "You've done the same for me, Lily. I thought I'd close myself off for good, that I'd never let anyone in again. But you walked into my life and changed everything. You made me believe in second chances." Lily turned to face him, her eyes searching his. "Do you think we can really do this? Build a life together after everything we've been through?" Richard smiled, a slow, sure smile that made her heart skip a beat. "I know we can," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "We've already faced so much together, and we've come out stronger because of it. Whatever comes next, we'll handle it together." Lily felt a wave of emotion wash over her, and she reached up to brush a strand of hair from his face. "I love you, Richard," she said, her voice trembling with the weight of her feelings. "More than I ever thought possible." Richard's eyes softened and he leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "I love you too, Lily. More than words can say." They stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, the city lights twinkling around them like stars. It was a moment of perfect peace, of knowing that they had found something rare and beautiful, something worth fighting for. Finally, Richard broke the silence, his voice warm with amusement. "You know, I think this is the part where we're supposed to say something profound about the future." Lily laughed, the sound light and carefree. "Like what?" Richard grinned, his eyes sparkling. "Like, no matter what happens, we'll face it together. And as long as we're together, we'll be unstoppable." Lily's heart swelled at his words, and she leaned in, pressing her lips to his in a soft, lingering kiss. "That sounds perfect," she whispered when they finally pulled apart. As they stood there, the night stretching out before them, Lily felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. The past had shaped her, but it no longer defined her. She had found her mother, pursued her music, and now she had found love, a love that was deep and true, born out of pain and healing. The future was uncertain, But for the first time, Lily wasn't afraid of it. She knew that whatever came next, she wouldn't have to face it alone. Richard would be by her side, and together, they would build a life filled with love, hope, and endless possibilities. As the stars shimmered overhead, Lily leaned into Richard's embrace, feeling the warmth of his love surround her. She knew that this was just the beginning of their journey, a journey that would carry them forward together into the future. And for the first time in her life, Lily felt truly, completely free.